Thank you again to everyone who's joined, and good morning. Today we will be talking about tracking your property's land value, going over some concepts about land values, and also using AcreValue to help with that. And so my name here, Jeff Nazuka. I'm the lead account executive, and I'll be your host for today. Specifically during this webinar, we'll be talking about a few things. Number one, let's start by going over some concepts to establish the current land values themselves. How do we do that? We'll talk about the comparable sales approach using what's called like-kind comparisons to be able to determine what the land value is. Afterwards, we'll talk about what are some ways to go and find comparable sales, making it easy by finding sales on a map, for example, and doing filters and searches to make sure that you're looking for relevant records. For anyone who's curious about tracking values over time, there are some ways to do that as well using AcreValue. So specifically, there's a Market Explorer tool that I'm happy to present. You can refine that as well to make sure that it fits your search. And finally, we do also have in-house land value estimates on AcreValue. We'll spend a little bit of time covering those too. So with that said, let's jump into for folks who maybe are coming to this conversation and want to learn exactly how to really establish that current land value, that's a great place to start. We'll start with some of the fundamentals here. And so where we want to start with is, what is the way to establish current land values? One of the ways that realtors and appraisers, for example, will use is called the comparable sales approach. The way that this works is it compares a property to similar properties that have recently sold. And so the idea becomes, if your property has certain characteristics about it, and you find other properties that have recently sold that are also similar, then maybe we can apply some of the other sale property values to your property. So what does this look like in practice? Well, if we have a subject property here, for example, let's say it's a little bit over 200 acres, it's in Illinois, mostly cropland, for example, specifically corn in this case. Let's, review some of the characteristics about this property. And so now we understand the types of properties that we need to go and find that have sold in order to establish what the value of this property would be. And so my next steps here would be to find some example comparable sales that would essentially say, these are properties that are similar in acreage. They've sold recently, as we can see by the sale dates. Maybe that's June of this year, maybe that's last fall. That's pretty recent. And we can use those values then to say, establish what the value of my property would be, right? You can do this in a couple of ways. Averaging these values is okay. Acreage weighted, for example, is another way, but you're essentially using sales that have happened to get to a value for your property that you are curious about. And so really, if we think about what we need to accomplish this, then what we'll need is the actual comparable sales themselves, right? We will also need to understand a little bit about our subject property so we know what types of sales to look for. And so what does that look like? What are some easy ways to go and actually find that information? Let's talk about how AcreValue can make that a little bit easier. And so let's jump into the AcreValue system. And what we're going to start with is, I've got a property selected here. I'm in Illinois as well. And so what we're going to start with is, let's start with a quick review of some of the characteristics of this property. So I can see immediately it is about 80 acres, give or take. Soil quality is very critical for Illinois properties. And so I can see that there's a PI value. That's your soil quality index right here. I can also see that it was mostly corn recently, and so I know that it is mostly cropland, row crop land. How do I figure out what the value of this property might be? And so if we think back to our two-step process on the comparable sales approach, we already know some of the characteristics about this property itself. So now I need to go and find sales records that will fit similar criteria to this subject property. And so what I can do here on AcreValue is flip over to the sold land tab. Right now I'm in the parcels map, which shows me all of the property boundaries themselves. I'm going to move away from that and I'm going to go to a map view that instead will show me flags of sales that have happened in the past, right? So each of these flags, let me zoom out a little bit here to show you. Each of these flags represents a sale of a property that has happened in the past. There's a lot of sales. As I keep zooming, you'll see a lot more that come up. And the critical thing to understand is that not all of these sales are going to be applicable for my subject property because not all of these other properties that I've sold look like my subject property. So let's then figure out which sales are the most relevant using that like kind comparison. And the way to do that would be to start filtering for those types of sales records that actually matter. And so what I'm going to do here, let's jump into Illinois. I'm in McLean County in this example. And if we want to filter more, I think we should. Let's go ahead and hit this more button here to actually do some extra filtering. On AcreValue, you do get a lot of options for filtering to say, I need to know the comps that fit exactly these particular criteria. Very common filter set is, for example, sale date. Again, the whole comparable sales approach relies on sales that have happened fairly recently. And so what we can do is we can maybe set the last year or so. Those will be the most recent, and we'll try and capture current market values. I know that roughly it should be greater than about 12,000 an acre. Critically, I do also know that my subject is about 80 acres itself. And so we can put a little bit of bounds up and down on that acreage value. So maybe we can do all properties that are greater than 60 acres, for example. This part is up to interpretation a little bit, but there's a range that you can put here. In Illinois, also fairly critically, we do know that soil quality drives land values, or is another way to measure that. So I can select my soil quality and I can say anything above, maybe 120 if my subject was around 125 or so. And so I have the option here to essentially get really specific with my filters so that out of the thousands of sales that meet my, or out of the thousands of sales that are actually present in that area of Illinois, I don't have to look through all thousands of them. I just have to look through the ones that are actually relevant for my search. And so when I hit apply filters to see what comes back, you'll see that most of the sales will drop off. That's good because the only ones that are left on my map, as you can see here, are going to be the ones that actually do fit my criteria for the types of sales that are similar in, all of the different property criterias that I've mentioned and are recent enough to valid to measure the current land values of the property. And so these are the sales that I'd be curious about. It looks like there are anywhere from 5 to 10 on my map right now. I can see that the flags are here. So here's one, here's another. I want to be able to click into each of these. And so what I can do here, I can start by clicking on each of them just to see some information about each of them. I do know in the top left corner here that there are more than just a handful of sales that do fit. So in most cases, and in this case, what I would recommend is opening up a list. And so on AcreValue, you can open a list to then represent the same information that you saw on the map. And so on the map, I have certain sale flags here. Each of these sales will be represented on my actual list here, one to one. And so if we're thinking about, how do I establish the values? Again, we're looking for sales that are recent and are as similar to the property as possible. These will be the ones that I should be taking a look at because I know that they are recent as I can sort and filter by the sale date to make sure that they're recent. I can also then ensure that they are similar to my subject because I put filters in to explicitly search for sales that are similar to my subject. And this is a great place to pause here for a moment and just make sure that everyone is able to see this. These are the sales that I would want to see to use to establish what the current market value would be for my property. At this point, of course, you'll want to dig into each of these sales a little bit more, right? Our goal here was to get from thousands of sales down to just the handful that would be relevant. You'll want to double check to make sure that each of these sales themselves is relevant. Things like, is it mostly cropland, for example? I do see that it is mostly cropland. In Illinois, this will either be corn or soybeans usually. So these are almost all corn or soybeans or a combination of both. That's perfect. The soil quality values are very similar as well. So very confident about that. These would be some great examples to use as an establishment of my market value. And so at this point, what we can do is we can select a few of these sales records to say, let's use these as an establishment of my value. At this point, we can then essentially average some of these values to come up with a reasonable market value for my property. And then add these to my list so that I can generate a full report that has my comparable sales as well as my subject property. And ultimately, the value that I'm going to go with is probably somewhere in the 13,000, 14,000, given these particular sales. It looks like there are sales that have happened that are almost pushing 17,000 an acre, and these are very recent. So I do know that it's capturing, what the current market trends are. There are also some sales that have happened that are closer to the 12,000 level as well. So maybe somewhere in the middle, maybe the 14,000 or perhaps 15,000 mark would be a decent estimate of what I can sell this subject property for. Once I kind of have these sales identified that I would like to use, ultimately, I would like to save this information in general. So what I'm going to do is generate a report here. And this will be the best way for you to be able to save the information that you've just researched, both information about my subject property that I am curious about, whether that's a property that I own or maybe I'm helping a client research it. And then also, again, the comparables that help derive that sale value for my subject. And so here I've got information about this is the subject that we selected. I can see all of its elevation, soil survey, flood hazard, all things that are important when, analyzing the property and deriving some of its property values. I can also then see what are the sales that I've selected, as well as if I want to dig into each sale a little bit further to see more information about it, I can then see, here's a property that sold. It was sold at 14,710 an acre, and it sold about a month ago. So this is probably very recent and probably fairly relevant to use as a comparable sale. If you're curious, you can also print this report as well. So there are PDF versions that you can essentially query up if that's something that would be helpful for you. If you're okay with just leaving the report in the website view and kind of flipping through the different maps and whatnot, that's also absolutely okay for you as well. So different options to be able to consume the information. We'll take a quick pause here. That was how to generate a comparable sales report, how to establish what the current land value of a single property might be, given that comparable sales approach that we talked about on the slide deck. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to transition over to say, well, this is talking about a single property and a single land value estimate in time, right? We're looking at current land value estimates. What about if we wanted to track land values over time, right? What if we wanted to see the values across maybe now and then a year ago, and then perhaps even a year before that, something like that? There is another tool on AcreValue to allow you to see that. It's called the Market Explorer. And so here, what we're taking a look at is the Market Explorer interface. The idea is this is an aggregation tool that will summarize all of the sale records that we've got on AcreValue given certain filter criteria here, right? And the output is here are some trends for sale price per acre, perhaps over time, in a time period that you select, as well as things like, how many transactions have happened over time, given my filters, what's the total dollar amount that's been sold over time. And so you can use these to track a little bit of, what are the actual trends that are happening in terms of the land markets in these areas, as well as perhaps, I am curious about my particular property. I just want to know the sale price over time. This is a great way to track that as well. For right now, I've just got the search on Illinois with some standard cropland parameters. But if I want to, I can adjust all of the parameters on the left-hand side here. So things like I want to be going a little bit further back in time, let's say I'm curious as to what land values were looking like before the pandemic. Maybe I could do that. If I wanted to dig into a specific county, I could do so. Or maybe I'm very curious to see primarily, cropland that is higher quality, actual production level quality cropland in Illinois. I've got all of these different filters available for me to be able to view those particular sales and what the market is doing in those categories. And so when I hit refresh my results, I now have the ability to say, let's take a look at just the results for those types of properties. And we can see now that over time, I've got a very clear trend of land values over time. This is available in every state. So in the lower 48, if you want to, you can use it there. We've got data for sales in all states in the lower 48. And so you should be able to just select the state that you wanted. If you wanted to see national sales trends as well over a certain period, you're more than welcome to query those up as well. Final point on the Market Explorer. Again, this is also exportable. So if you wanted to, you're more than welcome to select a PDF report export and print out, what is these, print out these versions of the graphs themselves. That'll generate off on the side there. So I'll let that query up. If you are also somebody who wants to see the actual sales data that created this heat map as well as created the trend lines themselves, there are ways to view the underlying data here. So that will take you back to the actual Market Explorer tab or the sales database with the filters attached that you actually use to search for these trends here as well. So a fantastic tool that allows you to track land sales not only just for current trends, but also over time. And so maybe the final thing that we'd like to talk about here, I do want to save some time for Q&A because we do have some good participation here. The last thing that we'll talk about on AcreValue is for folks who are curious, AcreValue does also generate a land value estimate that is more or less our namesake, right? AcreValue, that's our AcreValue estimate, which is a representation of what we think that the value for property may be based on a lot of different criteria that are there. I think it's about 30 or so criteria that now that are used to define this AcreValue estimate here. Among them, of course, the comparable sales method is critical and included into that criteria. Things like soil types, crop histories, et cetera, are also going to be included. This value is visible when you select any particular parcel. So when you want to visit AcreValue and you're looking at properties themselves, you can simply just select the property. If we do have an estimate for that property, it will be visible at the top here. Note that a couple of, I guess, good guidelines for these values. Because it's an estimate on land values, we are definitely going to be a little bit on the conservative side in terms of these values themselves. So just keep that in mind when you're taking a look at the land values. It's going to be on the conservative side. In some areas, it may also lag about a year to 2 years behind. For anywhere that has the blue check mark and the blue boundaries here, this will be about a year behind. And then for all the properties that have the yellow boundaries, those will be about 2 years behind. Um, but we are currently looking to get these updated not only to the current land trends, but also expanding the most up-to-date model as well. So for right now, you'll be able to see these blue boundaries and blue updated land values in Illinois, for example. And we're working to get those updated to Iowa and then gradually out through the Midwest and the Corn Belt as well. So if you're curious about that, certainly happy to answer more questions there. It is an in-house estimate, so it in certain cases it could perhaps replace the work that you were doing to derive the value yourself. But for most professional users who I talk to, they're familiar with comparables. They're relying on comparable sales and that comparable sales approach that we talked about in the beginning to establish land values. And so what they will do is they'll generally rely on, like I said, this method of gathering the comparable sales records so that you can use an evidence-based approach to actually generate that land value amount. With all of that covered, then I think the final question becomes, how do I get started using this for the folks who are interested, right? So let's flip back over to the PowerPoint here, and we'll briefly cover how do I get started, right? So on AcreValue, there's a couple ways to get started in general. For basic info and tools, you can purchase a subscription at acrevalue.com. However, all of the things that I've mentioned in this presentation are actually going to be for power users and commercial. And so you'll want to contact AcreValue sales, whether that be myself or someone on my team, for a custom quote. Enterprise subscriptions are a little bit more custom in the sense that you get to pick and choose what types of information you'd want to include in your subscription. And so it's a lot more custom that way. Reach out to us. We'll work with you to learn more about your use case and therefore try and put together the right package that fits all of your needs. Now, it looks like we've got just over 6 minutes here left for the Q&A. I did see that there were quite a few questions in the question as well, and so let's try and tackle some of those. Thank you to everyone who put questions in the chat as well. We'll try and get through everything, and again, if we don't, we'll try and reach out to you after the conversation to make sure that your question is covered. The first question I did see, so um, this is one that I received. Again, just to make sure that this is covered, we are recording this webinar. So if you didn't see something, if we covered something a little bit quick and you'd like to go back and review it, or perhaps you had to jump on a little bit later, we are going to be sending and distributing out a recording of the webinar for later purposes so that you can review. Now let's take a look here. There's a couple questions about subscriptions. So yeah, let's tackle those as well. I do see a couple of questions about those. So there's a question, must I subscribe to AcreValue Pro to access this information? So yes, you do need a subscription to AcreValue in order to access not only the information, so the sales themselves, as well as the tools that I showed you to make the land value estimate process actually feasible. You will need a subscription to AcreValue for that. Depending on exactly the tools that you do want, there are a couple of short-term subscriptions that you may be able to pick up on AcreValue just by visiting acrevalue.com. We do have a pricing page where you can go check out. There is a subscription there that will have a couple of the different tools that you may or may not need. So just take a look at some of the subscription levels that are there. And there are a couple of options there for monthly versus annual as well. So if you're curious about just doing like a short-term use type of thing to start with, you can certainly start there. For anyone who would probably be using this for everyday use, or anyone who's going to be using this for professional use cases, again, I definitely recommend reaching out to myself for a custom quote. We will need you on the enterprise subscription, which is also going to be a better fit for you 9 times out of 10. Let's see. There's some questions about, perfect. Okay, so What is the difference between the green and purple labels? And also that might get into this other question I see about how is the data collected? Okay, perfect. So let's flip back over to the land sales database here, and we will take a look at this. So first, to answer the question about how is this data collected? So all of our sales information comes from public sources first. And so this is things like your county courthouse, your appraiser district, assessor's office. Certain counties will have different office names, but there's going to be an office in every county that records transfers of property deeds, aka sales of properties. And so wherever those get recorded, we have a process to go ahead and essentially pull the information from those areas, digitize them, and then get them back up onto our site here. Um, we do also have a separate program, which this is the point about the green and purple labels. We do have a separate program in which registered and licensed real estate professionals, so that is your real estate agents as well as appraisers, can essentially say either edit or upload extra comparable sales that they know about and have collected from their work across, their real estate careers, right? And so um, if they'd like to upload them into the system, we have a process for that. That's a fantastic way to essentially get a second set of eyes onto all of the sales that we've collected. And so we definitely recommend that that is a great use case for folks. It also allows us to have comparable sales in, for example, non-disclosure states, areas where there might be some sparse coverage, or areas where the county courthouses may be a little bit behind the times and it's a little bit more difficult to digitize the records. And so that is actually the difference between the green and the purple labels. So purple labeled comparable sales here are the ones that are automatically pulled from the public sources. And then the green labels are ones where there's been an extra layer of human verification, either by a licensed realtor or appraiser or one of our appraisal staff on our team. We do have a team as well who participate in this. Okay, let's see here. We've got about 2 more minutes. Okay, perfect. So let's take a look at
There's
some
a
of the
question about improvements as well, and I know that that's something on the roadmap about improved land filters.
Sure. For some areas, yeah, exactly. I do see that question. Is there a way to filter for improvements ranging from no improvements and up? So there is a couple of ways to do that. And so the one that I would start with would be this. And so if you're looking for no improvements, for example, that's probably a parcel that is predominantly either cropland, timberland, etc. Maybe it's a grassland property. In the more filters section, we do have a land use filter that allows you to select specific land uses like, cropland, grass pasture, non-cropland, forestry. I would stick to things like cropland, grass pasture, forestry, and then you're actually able to say what percentage of the field that is. And so, given that improvements are not classified as any of these three types of use cases, cropland, grass, pasture, forestry are very much either cropped or grass or trees, basically. You can essentially set that threshold fairly high, 80%, 90%, something like that, to make sure that you're only going to be seeing sales that do not have improvements on them. In some areas of the US, we do also have data on improvements themselves and how many there might be on properties. That kind of information is actually going to be in the property cards more than anything. So if you were to generate a report for some properties here, there are areas where there might be improvements and things like that. But for the most part, that's still an area where we need to do a little bit more data gathering. It's not super easy to try and find that information. There's not really like an overarching data set. And so we do need to do some extra work to gather that. And also, once we have it, it is on the roadmap to try and figure out how to implement that as best as possible. For right now, like I said, I would probably recommend starting with the actual land use filter, because that does track for, is it a cropland, grassland, pasture, or forestry type of property, and set your thresholds pretty high. We are about a minute past here. I do see that there are quite a few questions here still to be answered. And so, like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we will follow up with you directly if your question has not been answered, um, to make sure that everyone has next steps for the folks who want to contact AcreValue Sales for a custom quote. I will flip back over to my contact page here at the beginning. Go ahead and save my contact information if you'd like to reach out to me. We'll get started with the subscription, learn a little bit more about your use case, and try and find the right subscription level that'll fit your needs. Otherwise, I will leave us here. Thank you again for joining us on the webinar here today. Hope it's been very insightful for you. Appreciate the time and have a great rest of your day.